Welcome to the Shade Chronicles, an anthology-style podcast featuring short works of fiction and serial prose, specifically with a sci-fi and horror flavor. Your hosts for the podcast are Derek Leftridge and Lawrence Trokey.
Hi, this is Derek Leftridge, and I would like to welcome you to the Shade Chronicles.
Hi, this is Lawrence Trokey, and I also want to welcome you and thank you for spending your time with us. Let's get started with our first story.
KK's Journal by Derek Leftridge. Like every morning since around the end of Halloween when I arrived here, I've taken a left turn on Jefferson, then a right on Wilkins Place, then left on the Westwood Burn to Sammy's Cafeteria for breakfast. Soon, like most mornings, I'll be inhaling a plate of biscuits and gravy in my regular corner seat at the counter. Then, as usual, Tom Hall will come in, sit next to me, and he and I will kid each other about who can sit closer to the counter because of our girths. Then we will stop our teasing once the delicious, greasy food is served. Since moving here 2 months ago, I've gotten to know the majority of the residents of this quaint town. They're all basically trusting and kind. However, this town and its citizens will never be the same after I finish my job here in a little over a week and then vanish into the cold winter air. The layout of this Midwestern town is stunning, and it looks like it was sculpted out of the 1800s with its Victorian homes and Queen Anne architectural buildings. None of the homes are even relatively alike, since there are no subdivisions or homeowners groups to install the rules to limit the look or location of things. So each home has its own unique style and design. Sometimes this can be hard on the eyes when your neighbor decides to sell watermelons from his front lawn on a Saturday afternoon, or when the retired couple across the street decides to decorate their front yard as a homage to every gaudy windmill, bird feeder, and lawn ornament ever made. I guess the uniqueness is what I was drawn to put this location on my to-do list and get it checked off sooner rather than later. During this time of season, the leaves are changing to copper and lemon gold, and as the sun goes down, the evenings are filled with a brisk whisper of the Arctic chill coming from up north. The entire town is built around an active railroad track that splits the town completely in half, and even though there are small detour bridges over the tracks, most roads become a parking lot when a train comes through and life has to stop. Everyone must wait as commerce finishes its way through the town, and consequently, this is lucky for me because it gives me time and great opportunity to see my fellow townspeople and reflect on their lives and how I must affect and disrupt them, whether they like what I do or not. And by the way, I like what I do, a lot. As I sit in traffic on Wilkins, I catch a glimpse of Mrs. Tiebler working diligently to keep her already manicured lawn up to her unrealistic expectations. It is a pure obsession of hers and is always the talk of the town at Sammy's during breakfast. Mrs. Tiebler is a widow with 2 children, a daughter, Mile, and son, Trent, but they no longer live with her. Also, her husband passed away 10 years ago, and she was left with a large home and a lot of yard to groom, which she does daily, and at times it seems the entire day. A frustration of widow Tiebler is that the neighborhood children ride up on her lawn with their bikes as they go down the sidewalk. It started out as an accident, but now with the reaction it garners, many do it on purpose. The reaction is a loud slam of the front porch screen door as widow Tiebler leaps onto the porch to get a view of the yard violator. She then proceeds to scream at the child, whom she knows by name, and announces she will tell their parents at church on Sunday about how they are destroying private property. And without any cursing back or gestures, the children giggle and quickly pedal off down the sidewalk, leaving widow Tiebler scowling in her front yard. Widow Tiebler has not seen her children since her husband died, since they both moved away and do not get to visit very often because of their own lives. She is 75 years old and the resident crabby old woman who lives down the road, and even though she is often upset and yelling at children, she is one of the good people on my list. What she wants to do is move from the home to a resort where her sister lives in Florida, but she cannot because she stubbornly is not able to get the house sold because although many people have looked at the house, it is priced way too high. To widow Tiebler, the price includes history and 30 years of upkeep, so she will not budge on the amount, and this makes me smile because I'm the only one who knows she will get the price she wants and will not be a burden to anyone in this town ever again very soon. As the train finally passes and traffic begins to move along, I notice Charles McFrain rushing across the street a block ahead. He's going to work at a small office right in the middle of town, with his briefcase swinging by his side and his tie flying in the wind as he jumps up on the curb. He's a workaholic, and this is an issue with his wife and daughter because they feel the strain of the business gets him out of the home early and brings him home late. On more occasions than not, he must also work Saturdays and a lot of Sundays. Unknown to him, his wife Mallory has secretly begun to look into getting a divorce, but rest assured, this entire family will have come together in a great sea of harmony at the end of my stay. Pulling into my spot in the parking lot of Sammy's, I see Drew Monarch coming out between Sammy's and the music store next door. He must have slept in the alley between the two buildings last night again. This young man is a very sad soul. Drew is almost 18 years old and does not go to school and also is homeless and sleeps all around town most of the time. Drew hates everything about this town and the people in it, and he has a metaphorical naughty list, and his parents are on top of the list. He was very close to his grandfather and loved hearing his grandfather's stories from his personal journal about growing up in this town as a young man. The stories included how his grandfather and his friends would walk all over town and in the woods and spend their days on adventures around the town. Particularly, Drew liked hearing the stories about how they would go into the old mine tunnels interweaving under the town, left abandoned after the mine closed 60 years ago. The stories were always about unexplained things heard and seen during every excursion, and in particular multiple stories of a person walking the tunnels, checking things off a list, then disappearing around a corner or a fork in the tunnel system. There were 3 journal entries in particular about this person being seen and followed by members of the group. His grandfather's friend Arthur had to use the tunnels during a tornado to be safe and to stay out of a storm as he was riding his bike home. As he was riding through the tunnel, he saw the man with a clipboard up ahead and turned left into another tunnel system. Arthur rode cautiously, and when he got close to the other tunnel, he heard bells in the distance but did not see the man. Other friends, Tanya and Autumn, were looking in the tunnels for gold they had heard could have been left in the mines when they saw a flash of light a few feet ahead of them. They stopped and yelled, "Hello? Is someone up there?" The light shone right in their direction, then disappeared, and then the tinkle of bells was heard. The last story was when Drew's grandfather and his friends were all in the tunnel system recording sounds and trying to talk to ghosts. The person with the clipboard and light walked briskly across the tunnel about 40 feet ahead, and they all ran in that direction of the mysterious person. In no time, they got to the point where the person was headed, and they turned left, and it was a dead end about 2 feet in from the tunnel. They all felt around for a hidden door or loose stones, but nothing. Oddly enough, one of the girls' watch alarms went off, and it was the sound of bells. And from that point on, the friends started to call the apparition the Bellman. The lore of the Bellman continued for about another 10 years until a tragic incident occurred. Like Drew's grandfather and friends, another generation of children began to venture into the tunnel, but even though there had been warnings about the dangers, the children liked to push the limits. One particular child was Anthony Scirocco, who was dared by other friends to venture into a part of the tunnel that was hastily covered with boards at the entrance. After about 2 minutes in the pitch-black tunnel, Anthony bumped into a support beam that was rotten with age and caused a collapse, and he was buried and died below the rubble. After that, large earth movers were brought into the town on flatbeds of the trains by the city, and all the known entrances were covered with tons of earth. When his grandfather passed away, Drew was given all the journals and went off into the woods and disappeared. Many say he went to the tunnels because of the secret entrances and maps were in his grandfather's journal, but none of this could be proven. When he was finally seen again in town, everyone noticed he had changed, and his parents did not seem to trust or understand him anymore. However, I know Drew has a fondness for writing stories that have a mystery and a ghost flavor to them. He spends most of his time writing in a leather-bound journal, as his grandfather did, and I know this because I gave him the journal. Not to sound repetitive, but when I am done here, Drew will have one hell of a story to write about in his own journal, along with being the main character, whether he wants to be or not. About 6 months after my visit to Middlebrook, and from how this reads, I guess my job was successful. The article is from their newspaper and written by a very special person, and I always wondered if they ever realized what truly happened. The article reads, "This Day in History," written by the Town Wordsmith, in quotes. The Middlebrook News, Final Edition, June 24th, 2030. On this beautiful summer day, I would like to reflect on the terrible event that occurred here on this date 7 months ago in our town of Middlebrook on an extremely cold day. The event I speak of is the huge ice storm that damaged one city block of business in our town, and the story was carried by many large news outlets, and they deemed it the mayhem in Middlebrook. Those of you who were living here at the time will probably remember. Unknown to all the rest of us who lived here at that time, Mrs. Tiebler and her deceased husband owned the entire section of land. We found this out after she moved away to a retirement community in Florida 2 weeks after the mayhem in Middlebrook. The entire block was already signed over to Mr. McFrain and his family. Mr. McFrain owned a business in the old building that was destroyed. Mrs. Tiebler always admired Mr. McFrain's work ethic, and it reminded her of her husband. He also did all he could to keep his rent paid on time and keep the office in good shape. So to pay him back, Mrs. Tiebler put the entire block of land in his name when she left town. After the insurance was paid out and had to pay a large sum since every building in this town is a historical site, McFrain purchased Mrs. Tiebler's home for the price she wanted. He will now open up the home as a bed and breakfast and run it with his wife and daughter. Just today, I heard Mrs. McFrain is pregnant. Congratulations to them. The area that was hit hardest because of the storm celebrates a 6-month anniversary today. The two main businesses are the historical headquarters for this town and the home of this local newspaper and my boss, the Middlebrook News. So it seems that everything and everyone here has continued to benefit greatly since the ice storm. Also, the town is showing no signs of slowing in its rise on the economic front. Just take a look at the homes and businesses that are going up and that have since the devastation 6 months ago, along with the increase of commerce, be it trucks and trains. The only thing I still wonder about is where the beloved Mr. KK disappeared to since the storm. He has not been seen. Some say he died in the ice storm, since that was the last place I saw him in the shadows that early morning. The temperature changed almost instantly and freezing rain began and quickly covered the trees, power lines, and everything. The wind began to howl louder than ever, and this woke me up. The makeshift blanket I made from a discarded rug from a dumpster became ice-covered and heavy on my chest. I lifted my head to see Sammy's cafeteria, which I was sleeping behind, was on fire. The back door was open and a power line from the ceiling was flopping around and igniting everything it touched. As I was rushing to get up and bolt out of there, I heard a scream from inside the kitchen. Blake, the grandson to the owners of Sammy's, was trapped behind a burning shelving system that was blocking his way to the door and the alley and freedom. The building began to groan and crack, so I covered myself with the rug and ran to save him. When I got him, he was hysterical and screaming for me to get his grandparents who were still asleep upstairs. A loud snap and crash from the front of the building could be heard, and ice-covered roof above gave way and came down on us. All we could do was run for the alley because the grandparents were probably already dead, and we had to get out before we even ended up the same way. My memory of the last time I saw Mr. KK was right after the fire. I was dizzy from carrying Blake from the collapsing cafeteria, but I will never forget what he was wearing. He had those black boots on he always wore, and they were shined up to a gleam, and his hair and beard were whiter than I ever saw on him. He also seemed a lot heavier, too. Besides his weird attire, he was writing in a notebook while looking at me as I rolled Blake to safety. And during all this chaos, he then shut the notebook and stepped back into the smoky fog the rubble had cast over the town on that frigid December morning. He looked at me and stepped deeper into the fog. He then tapped the side of his nose at the same time, and the fog got very thick, and as I reached out to him, I must have passed out. Right before going completely out of consciousness, I heard the tinkle of bells in the distance. My questions are, what happened to him? Why did he come and stay in Middlebrook anyway? Did he somehow have anything to do with the freak storm? Those are a few of the questions I wish could be answered. This article was written by the town wordsmith, who was Middlebrook's very own Drew Monarch, the resident town historian.
Attention Shade Chronicle Podcast listeners. The merchandise store is now open. You can find the merchandise store on the merchandise tab on the Shade Chronicles website, which is at theshadechronicles.com. Find premium t-shirts, hoodies, tank tops, travel mugs, ball caps, and more at the Shade Chronicles Podcast merchandise store. We now resume your regular programming. Santa's Claus by Lawrence Trokey. He went over his list and then checked it twice, as he was in the habit of doing. He learned the hard way to double-check himself after the fiasco with Napoleon. Who knew if he gave the kid a set of toy soldiers that he would eventually try to take over the world? Ever since then, he made sure about everything he did. Mistakes made by someone of his influence and power could have devastating effects, so he did not take chances. His calculations all told him the same thing. He removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, trying to erase what he saw on the page. The moon would be full at the 90-degree north latitude and 0-degree longitude for the next 2 weeks. The same 2 weeks leading up and through the winter solstice. He picked up the almost empty vial he had sitting on his desk. There were only a few precious drops of the potion left now, and no way to get more, not since the wizard died a few years ago. Pondicet had been getting weaker over the years, even though he refused to admit it or ask for help. There was nothing anyone could have done. His fate was tied to that of the planets, and if global warming was to continue unchecked in its progress, it was only a matter of time for Old Man Winter. Pondicet did give him one more vial of the potion before he died, and that lasted almost a decade. Now there was nothing to keep the beast in check. He would have to take measures, extreme measures, to make sure things did not get out of hand. Santa stood up from his desk to stretch and get another cup of cocoa. He grabbed a cookie from the plate where the carafe of cocoa sat on the credenza by his office door. God, he loved cookies, and the elves in the cafeteria sure knew how to make them. He nibbled on the cookie while he poured the cocoa into his cup. He realized he had to talk to her and make plans for how they would manage the next few weeks. She would know what to do. She always had a plan. Going back to his desk, he pressed the intercom and said,
"Gilana, please ask Mrs. Claus to come to my office right away."
"Yes, sir,"
Gilana replied. A few minutes later, she opened the door to his office. She was stunning, he thought. Every time he saw her, he was amazed at how great she looked after all this time. If you asked her what her secret was, she would say Pilates, but he knew better. She was a world-class athlete. Even better than that, the magic that had allowed him to live as long as he did also made her strong. Plus, she loved to work, and she could outwork any elf in the place. He stared at her for a moment, her muscular, slender figure wrapped in a Victorian-style belle dress. She outshined any princess he ever met. All the images of her adorning Christmas cards, decorations, in books and movies, they all had it wrong. Mrs. Claus was a stone-cold fox, not some pudgy, short housewife in an apron. He hoped they would still have more time together after all this was over, but he knew not to get his hopes up. "Hi, sweetie, what can I do for you?" Mrs. Claus asked with a smile.
"Please sit down, dear. We need to talk."
Santa gestured to the comfy, overstuffed chair.
"I didn't want to alarm you, so I kept this to myself for a few months until I knew I was sure. I want you to know I searched high and low for another solution, another way to handle this, but I came up short."
Her face dropped and she realized what he was talking about. "You don't mean—"
"Yes, I'm afraid I do. The potion given to us from the wizard has all but run out. There is no substitute that I can find. All the other remedies, excluding death of course, are not an option since we don't know the origin of the curse or the witch who is responsible for the curse. There is exorcism, but you know my standing in the church isn't what it used to be, so that really isn't an option either."
"What about going to Jack or Peter or even the fairy? Maybe they have magic that can help."
"Jack won't take my calls after the incident during the blizzard of 1888. Peter is too busy on Easter Island to be of any help. Besides, he's a rabbit. The fairy doesn't have really strong magic either. Just a big hedge fund to pay for all the teeth she collects. She's kinda creepy anyway."
"Then the only thing left is what I suggested to you as a last resort." She leaned in over the desk and placed a hand on his.
"Yes, we need to prepare the bunker. Tell the elves to get it ready."
It has been nearly a century and a half since Santa had an incident. As soon as the last one happened, he went to Pondicet to ask for help, and the old man gave him the potion. It didn't cure him, but it allowed him to remain in control and prevent any more incidents. He thought back to how it happened. It's amazing how fast your life can be changed forever. He was in Romania on Christmas Eve, he remembered. He had just come up the chimney of a home he was visiting and was stepping onto the pitched wood-shingled roof when he saw the beast. His sleigh was supposed to be in the yard of the home waiting for his return, but instead it was circling the home in the air above. It was a sign the reindeer were in distress. Something was terribly wrong. He scanned the yard of the home and saw it. A big, furry, wolf-like creature feasting on one of his reindeer. Its blood splattered all over the new fallen snow. Santa couldn't believe his eyes. This monster had just killed Blixen's predecessor.
Ho, ho, holy shit!
Santa exclaimed. Normally a peaceful being, rage now filled Santa at the sight of his poor friend being ravaged by the demon. He picked up his bag and ran full out to the edge of the roof. He leapt into the air and swung his bag over his head. Santa landed in front of the beast and slammed his bag into him with the force of a freight train. The creature had no time to react. The bag filled with untold number of toys and its magical mass were enough to crush the beast's ribcage and send it flying back into the woods encircling the home. Santa looked down on the fallen reindeer and tears flooded his eyes. He wiped them away with his mittened hand and leaned down to touch the reindeer's head.
Goodbye, old friend,
he said solemnly as he stroked the fur of his forehead. He reached over and snapped off a silver bell from Blixen's harness. Next, he went into his bag and pulled out a small anvil and hammer. He quickly pounded the silver bell into a pointy spear tip. The next item he pulled from the bag was a long wooden staff and a strap of leather. Being the ultimate craftsman that he was, he quickly affixed the spear point to the staff with the leather strap. Wiping away more tears, Santa stood up and walked into the forest after the beast. He found it crawling along the forest floor away from the house. Its breathing was labored due to its injuries. Santa noticed its back had been broken when it collided with the thick trunk of a silver fir tree. Santa thought the tree would make a fine Christmas tree, though. He walked to the beast and straddled it. He raised the spear above his head and then thrust it down with all of his might into the creature's back. Bones splintered as the spear tip also ripped through flesh, fur, and ligaments, finally finding the creature's heart. The beast whirled with ungodly strength, knocking Santa over. As he fell, a clawed hand ripped down, slicing into Santa's forearm. Then it died. Santa watched as the beast slowly transformed back into the shape of a man, the poor soul who had fallen under the curse of the werewolf. He wrapped his arm and went back to retrieve his bag. It took several treats to lure the reindeer back to the yard so that he could continue his Yuletide mission. Santa looked at the scar on his arm as he sat behind the desk. He reached over to the intercom again and said,
Gilana, can you find Molostre for me and tell him to meet me in the stables?
Sure thing, Santa.
Gilana responded gleefully. He met Molostre in the feeding area of the stables.
Hi, Santa. What can I do for you?
The little elf was dressed in traditional elf attire, a long flowing robe adorned with intricate embroidery and delicate beading. He wore a pointy hat with a long tail and pointy-toed slippers that curled at the ends.
How many AR-15s are on the list this year?
Santa asked his chief elf. Molostre pulled an iPad from inside his robe and tapped it repeatedly for a second or two.
Inventory is pretty tight on those babies. Mostly American customers. Some Australians. We had a heck of a time just getting parts.
The elf continued to swipe and tap the iPad.
I need you to pull one and set it aside,
Santa said in a low voice, leaning in close to the elf.
That'll mean someone won't be very happy this Christmas.
The elf was surprised by Santa's request.
Find one that was going to someone who was just at the threshold of making the naughty list. We'll say they just didn't make the cut. We'll make it up to them next year.
Santa, what you're asking me to do is...
The elf struggled to come up with the words to explain his shock at such an odd request.
Molostre, it's important. Probably the most important thing I'll ever ask you to do.
Santa's insistence was followed by Molostre nodding his head in understanding.
Okay, Santa, I'll do it. Anything else?
The elf looked to Santa for more instruction.
Yes, make a clip of rounds with pure silver tips. Hollow points.
The next day, an hour before sundown, Santa and Mrs. Claus met at a wood building at the edge of the property they called the bunker. The structure was constructed with thick logs. It was box-shaped and had a flat roof. There was only a massive metal door, no windows, on its exterior. Malostroy had a couple of the elves standing nearby, awaiting instructions. Santa, in his heavy red coat and fur-lined red cap, motioned for them to come near.
Boys, I need you to help Mrs. Claus and I with something. You won't understand why now, but it is important that you do exactly what we say. Can you do that?
Malostroy spoke for the elves.
Sure, Santa, we trust you. How can we help?
Santa took them inside the bunker. On the far wall, heavy chains and shackles were hung. There was a wooden bench there as well. In the other corner, a wooden stool with a kerosene lamp was ready to light the interior space. Mrs. Claus instructed the elves to help shackle Santa while he sat on the bench. The elves were hesitant at first, but Santa encouraged them to do it. After a few minutes, Santa's hands and feet were bound in the shackles. Mrs. Claus ushered the elves outside. She came over and kissed Santa gently on the lips before she lit the lamp and then shut the door. Santa heard the latches fall into place, and he knew he was locked in. The elves built a fire outside of the bunker to keep Mrs. Claus warm. She stood there watching in the cold, pulling her cape tight against her as the moon rose over the horizon. From inside the building, the screaming started. The elves were shocked at the noise and frightened, but Mrs. Claus kept them calm. "Everything will be all right," she said. As the moon rose to its zenith, the screaming was replaced by growling and the rattling of chains. This went on for some time, then it slowed and eventually stopped. She had the elves stand watch at the building while she returned to the compound. She was back the next morning. She drove a sleigh pulled by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were skittish when they pulled up to the structure, but Mrs. Claus comforted them and they calmed down. 2 more elves came with Mrs. Claus, bringing cocoa and food to the elves that were guarding the bunker. Mrs. Claus went to the door and unlatched it. The elves watched from the warmth of the fire, eyes big with excitement and wonder. She emerged a moment later with Santa. His arm was around her and she helped him walk to the sleigh. There were tears and rips in his winter robe, and the elves watched him in silence as he got into the sleigh and then pulled away with Mrs. Claus holding the reins. The pattern repeated itself for several days. Each evening, Santa would go into the bunker, get shackled and locked in for the night. Every morning, Mrs. Claus would take him back to the main house to recover from his nightly ritual. Finally, the winter solstice arrived, only a few days till Christmas. Everything else at Santa's workshop at the North Pole was operating as it should. The toys were being made ready for their delivery on Christmas Eve. The reindeer were checked and inspected to make sure they were in tip-top shape for the job ahead. Everything was on schedule and working as normal, except for the lack of Santa's oversight and supervision. Mrs. Claus stepped into his role while he rested in their quarters. Rumors spread around the workshop about Santa's evening trips to the bunker, and while a gossipy sort of folk, the news did not distract them because the elves had an excellent work ethic. Santa called Malostroy to his bedroom, where he laid in bed, just having woke up from a nap. Malostroy came as called, and Santa thanked him for coming.
I know you have questions, Malostroy, but I need you to just wait a little longer for the answers.
Sure, Santa. Whenever you're ready, I can wait,
Malostroy assured him.
Good man. Now listen, whatever happened to the rifle I asked you to put aside for me?
Malostroy stood up and went outside the bedroom for a second. He returned with a wrapped box that was quite long for him to carry. The wrapping paper was shiny and colorful.
Here it is, Santa. The bullets are loaded in a clip inside the box, too. Pure silver hollow points, just as you asked.
Excellent. I can always trust you, Malostroy. Efficient and thorough through and through.
Malostroy blushed at the compliment.
Thanks, Santa.
Put the box under my bed. It will be safe there.
Malostroy did as instructed. He bid Santa a good day and went back to work in the workshop. Later that day, as dusk was coming quickly since it was the shortest day of the year, he rejoined Santa and Mrs. Claus at the bunker for what he hoped was the last night. They took Santa into the bunker, chained him as before, lit the lamp, locked the massive door, and then waited outside as the moon rose. Mrs. Claus waited for the screaming to stop, and then she told the elves there, "I have to leave early tonight, boys. Still much to do before Christmas Eve. Please stay here and watch over things for me. I'll be back in the morning."
Yes, ma'am. We'll see you in the morning then.
Molostroy assured her things would be taken care of for her. After she had gone, Molostroy and the other two elves sat around the fire and listened to the growling and chain rattling going on inside. They tried to ignore it and not let it scare them, but they were all a little afraid of what raged inside the bunker. One of them produced a flask of peppermint schnapps, and they passed it around as they sat and waited. A few minutes later, they heard a yelp coming from inside the bunker. That caused them all to stand up and look at the bunker door.
What was that?
Amron asked, looking to Molostroy for answers since he was in charge.
I don't know, but it didn't sound good.
Molostroy responded. Just then, they noticed smoke coming from around the edges of the metal door. They all realized what was going on and started to panic.
There's a fire inside the bunker. He must have knocked over the kerosene lamp and started it.
Amron cried. Molostroy turned to Glenclaws, the other elf standing watch.
Go tell Mrs. Claus to come quickly.
Glenclaws ran off as instructed towards the compound. Molostroy then turned to Amron.
Get a bucket from the stables. We need to melt snow to put the fire out.
Amron ran as fast as he could to obey the command. Molostroy faced the massive door. He had to keep Santa from being burned alive inside. He reached towards the latch, his hands shaking from fear. He grabbed it and pulled it with all his might. The massive door swung open. Smoke billowed out from the inside. The fire, which had spread all over inside, erupted with the fresh source of oxygen provided by the open door. A low growl could be heard over the flames just then. Molostroy thought about running away, but it was too late. A giant wolf-like beast wearing a shredded red robe came through the opening of the doorway. The robe smoked and smoldered from the embers that littered its shoulders. The shackles were still around the beast's arms and legs, but the chains had all broken, having been melted to the point of failure. The beast swiped a massive hairy arm at Molostroy, and the claws of his hand dug deep into elven flesh. Amron ran into the stables and found a bucket. He turned to run back to the bunker when he noticed the reindeer getting jittery and nervous. He tried to calm them, but his efforts failed. They only became more excited and afraid. The one named Donner broke through the gate of his stall and ran past Amron towards the open main doors. A few steps beyond, and he was in the air climbing towards the sky, not looking back.
Oh no,
Amron said to himself as he ran after Donner. He got to the doors of the stable when he heard the growling of the beast. He turned just in time to see the sharp teeth of the monster light down on his face. Glenclaws came running up the steps of the Claus house, nearly out of breath. He stopped on the porch to try to recover from his sprint from the bunker. He took a second and then launched himself at the door, pounding on it and screaming for Mrs. Claus. A moment later, she opened the door and looked at Glenclaws' face. That was all it took for her to know what was wrong. There were other elves out that night who saw the fire consuming the bunker. They ran to the maintenance shed to retrieve the wagon with the water pump. As they were hitching a reindeer to pull the wagon to the bunker, they all heard the screams coming from the stables, and they froze. The reindeer started jumping in a state of fear, straining against the harness. A moment later, a low growling could be heard on the wind. It grew louder with every passing second, an indication that something terrible was getting closer. The reindeer made one last attempt to break free, but instead only managed to pull the wagon away from the elves, frozen in fear at the sound of the beast approaching. It ran away with the wagon in tow, leaving the elves to face their fate alone. Then, in the doorway of the maintenance shed, the silhouette of the beast appeared. Fresh blood dropped from its claws and snout. Its devilish eyes fell on the elves, lit by an unholy light from the very pit of hell. It took one step into the shed, and the elves embraced each other, waiting for their gruesome end. When it took the next step into the shed, a gunshot went off behind it. The beast whirled to face the source of the noise. Mrs. Claus stood a few steps away with the AR-15 rifle leveled at the monster. "Nicholas, please try to remember who you are. Don't make me destroy you." She used his real name, hoping it would penetrate through the layers of the beast that now ruled his body and mind. The werewolf turned to face her, his sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight. His massive frame towered over her. He fixed his hellish eyes on her, while his muscles prepared to spring at her with unnatural speed and force. "I love you, Nick," she said right as the beast lunged for her. She pulled the trigger and unloaded the entire clip into his raging form. Normally, the weapon would be semi-automatic, firing only one round at a time, but Malostroy had modified it for full automatic based on Santa's instructions. The burst sent 30 silver-tipped rounds into the chest of the raging beast. He fell at her feet, inches from slicing her throat with his claws. She kneeled down to his face as he rolled over to face her. His body now transformed back into the man she fell in love with so many centuries ago. She cradled his face in her hands and kissed him one last time as he breathed his last breath. Then she fell to the side, weeping uncontrollably for a long time. Elves from all over the compound came to the scene and stood in silence as she cried. Sometime later, the elves carried her back to her home and placed her in her bed. The sun was just starting to rise on the horizon by the time they had cleaned up the compound and buried the dead. The next day, with Christmas Eve still 2 days away, the elves and Mrs. Claus met at the large silver fir tree in the courtyard of the compound. It was a special tree, one that Santa himself had found and brought home while out one Christmas Eve many years ago. The mood was solemn, and the elves stood in silence with their caps removed. Mrs. Claus came forward to speak. "By now you all know about the terrible curse Santa had endured for many years. He kept this secret from you so as not to worry you, and for many years we were able to keep things in check. Today we mourn the loss of our beloved friends in the shadow of the greatest symbol of hope the world has ever known, the Christmas tree. You see, this tree is more than a decoration. It is a symbol of hope, family, and love. It reminds us we are never alone in such dark times. We have each other. Now more than ever, we need each other for strength, inspiration, and love. Turn to each other now as I will turn to you. Let us hold on to each other until the pain of the tragedy passes and only the love remains. The love for those who have fallen, the love for those who remain now, and the love we extend to those we will serve in the next few days. If we let our sadness keep us from fulfilling our promise to the children of the world, then we are truly without hope. If we let ourselves fall into despair and fail to complete our task, then we are to be pitied. Santa knew you all were the most faithful, most trustworthy, most steadfast of any creatures who ever walked the earth. Join with me now as I will complete his mission to bring the world love, joy, and hope, if only for another day." The elves looked to each other after she finished. One by one, they began clapping and cheering to the point they were shouting at the tops of their lungs, laughing and dancing, ready to meet the challenge of another Christmas. When the cheering ended and the crowd thinned, Mrs. Claus stood staring at the beautiful tree in front of her for several minutes. Then her gaze shifted to look off into the distance at the moon rising slowly into the sky. She thought she heard the cry of an Arctic wolf, if only for a moment.
Okay, well, now it's getting close to the holiday season, so we both chose to do one that has to do with this guy up north, and I think they both are really good. So I'll let you start with the commentary part, Lawrence.
Sure. So KK's journal, obviously we're talking about Kris Kringle. We
Correct.
finally realize as we get through the story there. One of the things I thought at the beginning was you just created this incredible Christmas town. You know, I felt so nostalgic and was like, oh, man, I want to go there. You know, I want to be at this place during the holidays because it seemed like such a beautiful, family-oriented, you know, loving, warm place. I was really impressed with the description that you had of the places there, and then you throw the train set in there for crying out loud. I mean, everybody wants the train set at Christmas time going around the tree, and you have it going through the town. So tell me a little bit about what was the inspiration for you coming up with this idea of Santa Claus coming up with this journal and checking on people and doing all these things that he did.
Yeah, I mainly was from Santa just being someone who, in the mysterious way checks on us, knows what we're doing all the time. So I kind of gave it a little more of a physical appearance by, putting him down in the mine trails and him being the one that's running around and disappearing. And then he's also the one that is telling the story at the beginning and describing the town and the people. And I wanted it to be kind of a Christmassy feel at the beginning, but then turn around and slap us all in the face with how he's being destructive to the town. And in essence, the main reason is he's doing what he has to do to reset it so he can help everybody. So it's actually a good ending type of thing. And then I also wanted to make Drew, who dealt with stuff with his grandfather passing away and then disappearing in the woods, coming back, and then at the end, him being the one that is the historian of the town that knows all about it and is still wondering what happened and doesn't really completely get that it was Kris Kringle that was the one that was in the town doing everything.
Sure. So, Kris Kringle kind of almost takes on a godlike persona in that, he not only visits good but also bad on a particular situation, but then he can turn good things or bad things into good things through just the way he orchestrated everything and putting everything together.
Right, yeah, he affected the weather to where it was devastating on the town. It became so bad that it was a national story, and he did fix things at the end, as you heard. So yeah, that's what it was. It was kind of taking him from being what we normally know him as the jolly goof, as we would say, and obviously in your story we'll get to, but he is not a jolly goof. He's pretty much a badass, and he has the abilities to do things that aren't just, drink milk and eat cookies.
Right,
I like that
exactly.
part. Yeah.
And tinker around with toys and hang out with elves.
Yeah, so that brings us to Santa Claus, and a couple of notes I have that I wanted to go over was I love the voices.
Thanks.
Those are really good.
Had fun with that.
At the beginning of it, I was like, okay, is he? Yeah, he's doing voices. That's good. That's good. I like that. And it actually gave depth to the story. It's a very, in my opinion, sad but inspirational story in a good way. And again, it puts Santa Claus in a better light than just being this person that's at the mall that you sit on his lap and whatever like that. It kind of gave him a background, which I think they're kind of doing nowadays with different stories for him, for Santa Claus character. But I liked your story.
Well, thank you. Yeah, again, this story came from the title. I love puns. Santa's Claus, is that type of pun that got me thinking, okay, what can I do with that? Where am I going with that? Well, Claus naturally means werewolf, right? I mean, that's what you think of when you think of Claus. At least that's what I think of. So, call me weird. But I thought, what if Santa Claus was a werewolf? Well, how does he become a werewolf? Well, obviously he has to go through the same process that every other person who became a werewolf in any story ever created goes through. He has to be attacked by a werewolf. So how does he do that? He encounters one on Christmas Eve, and that's where everything kind of goes from there. He's attacked by a werewolf who's attacking, his reindeer, that kind of thing. He saves he doesn't save poor Blixim, but he deals with the problem in a way that only Santa Claus could, and then he has to deal with the consequences of being attacked by a werewolf. And I had done a little research to come across this wizardy kind of person. And I mean, basically it's from the Rankin Bass animation story of the Old Man Winter wizard guy that you'd see in those kind of things. Mm-hmm. But I thought, well, let's give him a Native American twist. So I found someone in the Native American tradition that would fit that same bill as Old Man Winter. And I thought, okay, well, we'll make him the guy who comes up with a solution for Santa Claus. But then let's throw in some reality. Global warming. Global warming kills off Old Man Winter. Just like global warming is apparently killing us all. So from there, Santa has to deal with, how do I get past this issue? And their solution was to lock up Santa Claus during the most dangerous times. And of course, you can't lock somebody up without allowing them to get out and cause carnage. And that's what happens at the North Pole. And I thought, instead of, Santa Claus being a werewolf and tearing up people, let's just have him attack elves.
Right. Dispensable.
So, yeah, they're not real things.
Sorry to any elves out there.
Yeah, if there are elves, sorry. But, this was a reasonable expectation, being at the North Pole, that he's got to kill something and let it be elves. So, and then I thought, well, let's also bring it into the modern days with empowering Mrs. Claus to take out the threat and then assume the role as, basically, instead of Father Christmas, Mother Christmas. Mm-hmm. She's going to be the one who takes over Santa Claus's job from this point on. So, it's an empowering kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked it because I liked the buy-in from every character into it. That was really cool. That put me into the situation really well, reading it and listening to it. And then also, I thought at the end there was a little bit of a mystical kind of thing of, for Santa, kind of remembering and knowing that there's still that kind of presence out there in a sense. But it was really good.
Thank you so much. So that's gonna finish up episode 5 and finish up season 1 of the Shade Chronicles podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned. In a few short months, we'll have episodes for the second season of the Shade Chronicles. And just in closing, Derek, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for going down this path with me and taking on this project. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yes, I did. I'm ready to do another season. We got to get our stuff together and kind of go through our lives a little bit and get things set up for the next season, but I think it's going to be just as fun, if not more. And yeah, really great to reconnect and doing something like this, a project like this, because we did a lot of this stuff as kids, and now it's time to really share it with others to be able to see if they like it as much as we do. If not, at least we like it, so we're good.
There you go. One last thing before we shut things down for season 1 is that we want to invite any of you that would like to participate in submitting stories for the Shade Chronicles podcast to be able to do that. What we're looking for is complete audio files, kind of in the same way that we produce these stories that we have on the Shade Chronicles podcast. You can email us at shadechron@gmail.com for more information and get all the details about what you need to submit and the kind of stories that we're looking for. If you've been listening to our Season 1 episodes and kind of getting a feel for the type of stories that we're doing, sci-fi, horror, but we don't get really hardcore on any of this kind of stuff, so we like to keep it light, we like to keep it funny in a lot of ways. So that's kind of the spirit that we're doing these things in, and again, you'll get more information if you email us at that shadechron@gmail.com in terms of submissions. So anything you'd like to add to that, Derek?
No, I think it would be great just to see what type of things individuals maybe have out there to really be able to add it to our collection of the Shade Chronicle episodes. If it works out on both ends, that's great. I think it would be something to really look into and that we can start doing for our second season.
Yeah, so we'd love to fluff up the second season with your input and your stories. So if you are interested in doing that, just give us an email, send us an email, and we will contact you to let you know all the details. So again, thanks to everyone who's participated and listened to the Shade Chronicles podcast, Season 1. Stay tuned for Season 2 coming up in a few short months here on Spotify and other places that you enjoy your podcast. Thanks again to everyone, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thanks again for listening to the Shade Chronicles. For comments or inquiries, you can contact us at shadechron@gmail.com. That's shadechron@gmail.com. Visit us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also get more information at theshadechronicles.com. The Shade Chronicles Podcast is the creative property of Derek Leftridge and Lawrence Trokey. Stories in this podcast were the sole creation of Derek Leftridge and Lawrence Trokey, respectively. Any attempt to replay for broadcast or distribution portions of any episode of the Shade Chronicles without the prior written consent from the creators and/or significant compensation is strictly prohibited. Shame on you for even thinking about it in the first place. Thanks again for listening. Tune in next time for another episode of the Shade Chronicles.